You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. In the last episode, we talked all about the history of sex education in the United States. And as we discussed, the sex ed we have isn't really working, and it hasn't actually gotten much better over time. In fact, if anything, sex ed is getting worse because far more states are pushing to restrict sex ed than to expand it. So in today's show, we're going to talk about why it has been so difficult to make sex ed better and what we can actually do to change it. As we'll discuss, one of the things that's holding us back is that we don't have a federal mandate for sex ed in the US, unlike in other countries. So it's something that's handled primarily at the state and local levels, which means that if you want to improve sex ed, it starts by advocating for it in your local community. We're also going to explore how many states require comprehensive sex education today, what good sex ed actually looks like, why we need to stop thinking about sex ed as a one-time class or talk, as well as where to go for high-quality sex ed resources. I am joined once again by Margaret Grace Myers, a writer, researcher, educator, and former bookseller based in Maine. She is the author of the new book, The Fight for Sex Ed, The Century-Long Battle Between Truth and Doctrine. This is going to be another fascinating conversation that you won't want to miss. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. Are you looking for a space that celebrates diverse perspectives, explores new frontiers, and brings all of your favorite people together? The annual Sexological Conference, hosted by Sexual Health Alliance, is where sexuality leaders gather. This conference connects you with world-class experts, leading sexuality companies, and a community of like-minded, passionate, and welcoming professionals. You'll find your people at the Sexual Health Alliance Annual Sexological Conference this October. Get your ticket to be inspired, educated, and empowered. Note that this conference is open to anyone and everyone. Head over to sexualhealthalliance.com, select the Annual Sexological Conference page, and save your spot today. Join leading researchers and experts for insightful presentations and discussions on the evolving landscape of sex and aging at the Kinsey Institute 2025 Specialty Intensive and Symposium this fall. This event will take place on October 4th, 2025, with both online and in-person attendance options available. To learn more, visit kinseyinstitute.org. And to stay up to date on the latest events and educational opportunities, follow @Kinsey Institute on the socials. Okay, Margaret, in the last episode, we talked all about the history of sex education in the United States. So today we're going to discuss the future of sex ed and how to make it better. But as a starting point, how many states today even require that students receive sex education? And of those that do, how many of those programs are actually worthwhile?
So I always use SIECUS, which is a group that I write about quite a bit. I think it no longer actually stands for what it originally stood for. I think it's just SIECUS, Sex Ed for Social Change now, but it used to be the Sexuality Information Education Council of the United States, and they do great work on sex ed advocacy. Let's see, 27 states and DC have laws requiring sex ed. Then there's the complication that 36 states and DC require instruction on HIV/AIDS. Mm-hmm. Some of those overlap, some of them do not. 5 states have instruction on health. Some of that includes sex. Some of it does not. 14 states require abstinence only. 16 states do not require sex ed. Does that answer your question? Because the answer should be not really, because it's all extremely complicated. But 5 states have really strong positive laws that require comprehensive sex ed.
Yeah.
So that's really the gold standard. And by gold standard, I actually just mean really what all sex ed should be. And unfortunately, that is right now the gold standard, when really it should just be kind of actually the bare minimum. And that's really the state of sex ed right now. It is a hot mess, frankly.
Yeah, so sex ed is required in a lot of states, but just because it's required doesn't mean that it's good. So there's only a small number of states where it's mandated that you do comprehensive sex ed. In most of the states where there's a mandate, it's just teach something, right? And in a lot of those states, it doesn't necessarily even have to be medically accurate what they're teaching people. So you kind of just never know what you're getting when it comes to sex ed. So yeah, just because there's a requirement in place doesn't mean that it's going to be a positive thing.
Yeah. The other thing I didn't realize either is that sometimes you can have actually good guidelines, and then it doesn't matter if if the schools comply with those guidelines. So you can have really great guidelines, and then you can go down the street to the school and say, okay, show me how you're following those guidelines. And they just might not be. And it doesn't matter. Nothing comes of it. But also, I mean, these are schools that, as we all know, are chronically underfunded. Teachers are running around. They are doing jobs of, 5 different teachers. So I get it, but it's a bit of a nightmare.
Yeah, but also, just because it might be required in some places doesn't mean it's always going to be delivered in an effective way either, because we don't do a lot to support teachers who are providing sex ed, which is a whole other issue. If you have the people responsible for teaching sex ed who got really terrible sex education themselves, or maybe just aren't even comfortable talking about the topic, that's not necessarily going to make for an environment that's conducive to learning and getting students to understand and be able to appreciate the information they're learning.
It's such a good point. It's so true.
So the way we teach sex ed needs to change. We live in a time where STIs are on the rise and pornography has become the default form of sex education. And the need for high quality sex ed is as great as it's ever been. But changing the status quo isn't going to be easy, especially here in the US. And I think a big part of the reason for this is because sex ed is something that's handled at the state and local level. And in many other countries, sex ed is mandated at the national level, but we don't do that here. So why is it handled locally here? Like, why have we never had a federal mandate for sex education?
Part of it is that there aren't huge guidelines for other subjects either. So it's like federally, we don't have the same English curriculum, math curriculum nationwide for all students. So in some ways, it is like other subjects in that way. Of course, what's so interesting about sex ed is the stakes are just so much different. I compare it to being like, in some math classes, you're getting taught that 2 + 2 = 4, but in other math classes, you're being taught that 2 + 2 = 5, and that is what it's like in the sex ed classes that we have here. Unlike, oh, well, we read Hamlet. Oh, well, we read Romeo and Juliet or whatever, where you're getting at the same content, which is in English class, reading, writing, sort of thinking, analysis, whatever. You might just do it in a different way. This is like, as I said in our last conversation, you are getting at the diametrically opposed things. And that's really the problem. The American public school is so fascinating. And one of the reasons why I actually found this project to be so illuminating too is that I think people don't think about public schools very much, because it is so unique for that exact reason, that it's sort of decided on neighborhood levels, school levels, local levels, and then state levels. And then sometimes there are these sort of national guidelines. There are these ideas about what standards students should be meeting. And then it ends up just kind of not really mattering in the end. And then any change just takes such a long time that by the time, a particular student is through their educational experience, any change is kind of long gone. Or, they sort of don't have the effects of it.
Yeah. So basically, if we want better sex ed, we have to work for it within our own local community. So if someone wants to try and improve sex ed locally where they live, is there anything they can actually do? Where do you even start with this?
Absolutely. People who are opposed to comprehensive sex ed, and what goes with that, with the definition of comprehensive sex ed is age appropriate, inclusive, medically accurate. The people who historically have been opposed to comprehensive sex ed in all of its forms, and like abstinence-only sex ed, have made it their business, regardless of if they have kids at all, if they have kids in that school district, if they have kids in their class. They have made it their business to knock down the doors of these schools. I mean, and that was sort of an older version of protest, but I mean, it works. It works. I talk about school board meetings. There was a school board meeting that was 9.5 hours long. It was from 9 o'clock in the morning to 8:30 at night. These are people who, and I'm not suggesting that everybody needs to do that. There are probably different ways to do that now, but this is a public health issue. It really is. When you have young people who do not know what a condom is, when we have the STI rates that we have in this country, it is one thing to sort of not teach about sex at all. It is another to be teaching an abstinence-only sex ed class. It's like we have carved out time to talk about sex, and we are not going to talk about condoms. We are not going to talk about STIs. I mean, that in itself is the biggest problem in a lot of ways, or one of the biggest problems, sort of philosophically maddening. So first of all, it's like, make it your business and do that work. And it is like, go to a school board meeting, especially if sex ed is on the table. Look at your school board members. I always make it a point to vote in school board elections and to see who's on the ballot. Ask about sex ed. I live in Maine and a very sort of small community, and I love to be able to just sort of say, oh, what do you think about sex ed? And people rarely have an answer. And that's fun to be able to, to sort of say, well, like subtly encourage people to have an opinion, so that's the kind of local level. Also, if you have a child, of course, you can ask to see curriculum that is often in state law. Part of that comes from this long history of protest. And I do think it's time for kind of our side to fight back and say, like, I do not want my child to be learning this. In Texas, if you teach sex ed, the state mandated curriculum, the last time I checked, you had to teach that heterosexual sex in the context of marriage is the expected and accepted way to be sexual. And that's being taught in public schools with taxpayer money, and I think it's worth it to use this rhetoric that we have heard a lot of, like, I do not want my taxpayer money going to that kind of messaging. I do not want my child to be taught that in my public schools. It's amazing the people who do not let it go, that is really what gets it done. But that also takes time and energy and effort. And we are all really short on that, or at least everyone I know right now. There are also some really amazing, like SIECUS, for example, is an amazing group. It just started a political action group called Educate Us, which is amazing. Throw money at them if that is how you do your action. Like, absolutely. There are a few states that have specific sex ed advocacy nonprofits now, which is amazing. Again, you have to sort of look it up and seek it out, because I think the other thing about sex ed that makes it so hard to get a grasp on is that there's so much to think about right now in the world and in politics and even in sexual politics, reproductive justice, sex, that sex ed kind of tends to fall to the bottom for reasons that I completely understand. But there are often people doing really specific work on policy in states, especially states that have really bad policies. So looking up states to see, there's like Honest Sex Ed Minnesota does this work in Minnesota. There are different groups that do really, really solid work.
Yeah. So I know sex ed is something that is politicized a lot, but actually there's a surprising amount of agreement across the political spectrum if you're talking about parents in terms of what they want for sex education, right? So there are lots of surveys that have been done showing that Republicans and Democrats alike in the general public are in pretty strong agreement about wanting more comprehensive sex education. Now, where you start seeing things get politicized a lot more is when you're looking at politicians specifically, the people who are deciding the policy, right? So, red states, blue states, they do tend to have quite different approaches to sex ed, but that's really more a matter of the elected officials deciding that as opposed to what the parents in those communities actually want.
That's such a good point. And that's actually true historically as well. Now that you say that, of course, that the surveys always kind of track that. Absolutely. There's almost this feeling of like, God, somebody else do it,
Right.
Great, good, somebody else. Then when you get to those higher levels, that's where you really see the opposition and it is enacted on that level. And that is really where the problem is, because those policies then have those very real impacts on everyone.
One of my favorite things about summer is that it offers more time for adventure. But not all of that needs to happen in the great outdoors. Summer is also the perfect time of year to go on some adventures in the bedroom. If you want to make this summer hotter than ever, check out Beducated, a pleasure-positive learning platform for sexual health and happiness. They have hundreds of expert-led courses that will guide you step by step through things you've probably always wanted to try, but weren't quite sure how. For example, if you've ever been curious about exploring kink, but weren't sure where to even begin, check out their course on dominance and submission. This course will walk you through everything you need to know, help you build up your communication skills, and give you a ton of ideas to try for sizzling scenes, from temperature play to toys. But that's not all. Check out their courses on bondage basics, dirty talk, and wax play if you want to expand your skills and really turn up the heat. So if you're looking to go on some exciting new adventures in the bedroom this summer, check out Beducated. Beducated is where toe curling pleasure meets expert-backed education. Get 60% off the yearly pass by using my last name, Leymiller, as the coupon code. This is an incredible deal and your discount is locked in for life. Try Beducated risk-free with a 14-day money-back guarantee. Check the show notes for the link and be sure to use my last name to get your discount. So I know that your work is focused specifically looking at sex ed in the United States, but globally speaking, are there any other countries where they're getting sex ed right, or at least doing it better than we are? And is there anything we can learn from them and in terms of how we might make sex ed better at home?
When you look at the sort of data, and you might know better than I do, of American rates of teen pregnancy, teen, STIs, in comparison to sort of industrialized countries, it is, if it wasn't so horrifying, almost laughably higher, which points to something really that almost every country other than us is doing something really different. There's actually a study from, I think it's 82, so certainly not any time recent, but I actually think it pinpoints the whole problem. It was a Guttmacher Institute study, and they basically said, America is the only country that puts money into programs that try to impact young people's sexual activity. And that every other country, 5 or 6 different countries, is just putting the research, the money into how do we improve the outcomes of teen pregnancy and STIs, which are pretty simple, right? It is not rocket science. Of course, there's always going to be, how do we get young people to use condoms more often? How do we talk about STIs? How do we get people to seek treatment? Of course, there are always going to be some level of that. But America's insistence still on trying to get healthy teenagers to not have sex, that I think will always be the key to why America's sex ed is so bad.
Yeah. And I think it's in large part due to the fact that we just don't really do harm reduction here in the US, and it's not just with sex, it's with lots of other things. Like I live in the state of Indiana, and a few years ago, we had a big HIV outbreak that was tied to needle sharing among drug users. And the state health agencies were like, if we have a needle exchange program, we can really reduce the rate of contraction of HIV because then people won't be sharing dirty needles. But our governor was like, no, you can't do that. Like giving drug addicts needles is just going to encourage and promote more drug use. And it's like, no, it doesn't, if you look at the data. But it's like with drugs, it's like with sex, we never want to seem to take the approach of equipping people with the information they need to make healthy decisions and to reduce risks and so forth. But instead, we're just like, no, don't do it, and that doesn't work.
It's so true. It really is. And so my very best friend runs a harm reduction program. I always say it's like a sober house, but it's harm reduction. And it is amazing how our conversations are this conversation. It really is amazing how, and she's a social worker, and this whole thing of, do you talk about an ideal world or do you meet people where they are? And what's really interesting, and I think the thing too with sex that is so fascinating, is it's hard to think about young people as sexual beings. And when I say young people, to be clear, I mean teenagers. 16, 17, 18-year-olds. I'm not talking about kind of, a 14-year-old who's, I'm talking about quote unquote old enough. Sex in America is just such a complicated mess. And it always has been, where on the one hand, it is like nobody has sex. You don't have sex until you get married. You date and then you get married and then you have sex. And on the other hand, it is what every movie and every song and every TV show and the whole point of life. And it is like, how is a young person supposed to square these ideas? So when we talk about, you sort of think, well, what is the underlying value here? That's where I sort of say, okay, if you want to teach your child in your home, I expect you to remain abstinent until marriage. Great, go for it. But the fact that we have put that into federally funded public school curricula is really something I don't think has been examined as much as it should be, because I think it is far more of a religious belief than people are really ready to recognize. It is a moral position, and it's not one that is shared by everybody, and that young people are getting so many mixed messages about all the time.
Yeah, so there are certainly lots of places that are doing it better than we are. And one example would be in the Netherlands. Like, I teach study abroad courses in Amsterdam every year, and I take a group of students over and we meet and speak with local sex educators there and learn about how their system works. And they have mandatory comprehensive sex education that actually begins in kindergarten. And I know some people freak out when they hear like, oh, sex ed for kindergartners, but it's not what you think. It's not like they're teaching kindergartners the ins and outs of sex or anything like that. Instead, it starts very young with learning basic things like, how do you communicate consent and boundaries. And in those early conversations, the term sex isn't even coming up at all. Like, instead, what you're teaching them is generalizable, transferable skills. Like, for example, if somebody is standing too close to you, how do you communicate that to that other person? And so it's just sort of like this simple thing of learning to express and communicate boundaries. And, when you can learn to do that from a very young age, and you can be comfortable standing up for yourself and asserting where your boundaries are, that can be a lifelong valuable skill to have. And so, the Dutch are a group of people who are kind of doing it right. They're doing it a lot better than we are. It's not to say that everything is perfect in the Netherlands. Even though sex ed there is mandatory, the schools still have a choice over which curriculum they use. And some don't always use the same curriculum, and some are better than others. So it's not like this utopia. I know a lot of people talk about it as being like, oh, everything is perfect. And, if you do look at the data and metrics in the Netherlands, they have the lowest rates of teen pregnancies, teen STIs, and teen abortions in the industrialized world. And so, there is data evidence that their approach is working. And I think there's a lot we could learn from them. And, in part, it's because the Dutch just kind of are a more pragmatic group of people.
And that's really it, right? This pragmatism piece is so important when it comes to sex ed.
Yeah, I mean, you can either tell people don't have sex and like pray that it works,
right.
which it won't.
And I'm like, historically, it never has,
Yeah. Or you can say, you know what? People are going to have sex no matter what we say. We're not necessarily going to tell them to do it, but we're going to equip them with the knowledge they need to make healthy decisions so that if they do have sex, they know how to best protect themselves and reduce the risks.
Well, and it's also maybe slightly tangential, but just an interesting thing. So I live on a small island in Maine, and I find myself running a preschool, and I tell people all the time, and they're kind of taken aback when I say this, but only when it comes up. I don't like blare it from the rooftops or anything, but I always say, sex ed begins at birth, and so much of it is attitudes, and people are sort of like, oh, what could that mean? And I say, it's a small program, like we're potty training. And so kids are, I'll have, we assume cisgendered until proven otherwise. We have little girls who see penises and they're like, what's that? And it's like, so I always say to my teachers, I say our choice as educators is like, we can teach a child through our response that it is weird and bad and shameful to talk about bodies, or we can say that's his penis, like finish the diaper change, and then it doesn't come up again. I always think when I think about it, talk to parents, I'm like, we are happy for kids to know elbows and nipples and, their feet and all their hands. But like even the word penis and vagina have become this, like, all of a sudden you hear your kids saying that word and it's like this big dark cloud. And you just think that's their body part, or that is a body part of the other half of the world. It really makes people think when I say, is there a reason that you don't want your child to know that word? And it's really fascinating to kind of watch those conversations happen. And usually it drops immediately. But I'll have kids who will sort of often after the potty training thing, it just kind of goes away. But then by the time they get to be 3 or 4, they'll be like, so girls have vaginas, boys have penises. And I'll be like, yeah, pretty much, and then they'll be like, okay, can I go outside and play? And it's like, yeah, and it's that is one of the ways that we teach sex ed every day from birth, where you learn that sex is normal and fine, and penises and vaginas are things that most people have. And it's not a big deal.
Yeah. I mean, the more we shroud sex and genitalia and all these other things in secrecy, the more that just kind of breeds curiosity, especially on the part of youngsters, right? And when it becomes this secret and mystery, then you're going to end up dealing with even more questions about it. And, so it's a decision you have to make. If you just kind of normalize it early on, it actually makes things a lot easier and is less awkward in the long run.
Totally. Well, and all the data to suggest that kids who know the names of their genitalia can, not that it's ever their problem to report abuse, but they can report abuse, and actually kind of, even by being able to name their body parts, tend to be able to sort of prevent abuse by being like, don't touch my vagina, that a child who knows that and knows their body parts, that's kind of an advantage versus a child who's sort of don't touch my private parts. It's that could sort of mean anything. It's really empowering to teach a young person the name of their body.
Something else I was thinking about is how one of the problems that we have with sex ed is that way too many people think about it as this one and done kind of thing, where you have to figure out just the perfect age to have the quote unquote talk, right? And so it's just a one-time conversation, or it's a one-time class that you take in middle school or high school. But I don't think that's the way to look at it. We need to rethink sex ed as something that is ongoing and is age appropriate and is teaching you what you need to know at different stages of life, because you can't possibly teach somebody everything they need to know about sex in the span of one conversation.
Absolutely. Right. And that the way you talk about penises, vaginas to a 3-year-old is totally different than how you talk about it to a 12-year-old, and completely different than a 16-year-old, right? It's all going to be, because the contexts are so different and they are thinking about them in different ways, at those points.
Yeah. So for people who want to get more resources on sex education, maybe tips on, how to talk to their own kids about it, or how they can help to create a better sex ed curriculum where they live, do you have any resources you would recommend?
Yeah, there's so many good resources. SIECUS is great for if you want information about your state and what is going on those state levels. Planned Parenthood is, of course, going to always kind of be a powerhouse in kind of information. Advocates for Youth is another really good one for kind of same thing of just advocacy and information. It really depends on what you're looking for, but there's so many kind of amazing local organizations, again, doing that advocacy work. There's Scarlet Teen for if you kind of are a young person looking for information yourself, that kind of thing. I mean, there's good stuff out there, and it's unfortunate that it is sometimes hard to distinguish from the bad stuff. And that is really the problem, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, you kind of got to know where to look. Well, thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Margaret. It was a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and get a copy of your new book?
Yes, absolutely. The book is called The Fight for Sex Ed. Buy it at your bookstore, your local bookstore. If they don't have it, they'll order it for you, I promise. And then I'm mostly on Instagram these days is the best place to find me. And I think I'm just Margaret Grace Myers there. This has been so wonderful. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller, and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.